Hi, everyone. This is Raquel.
Hi, and this is Jennifer.
Welcome to Madness Cafe.
This is a feminist podcast where we talk about women's issues, politics, and health and wellness.
And where those issues intersect. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Madness Cafe. Today, we are joined by Pey Carter. And hold on tight. Pey's got a really great bio, so I'm going to read the whole thing. Sit tight. Pey is a disabled veteran and survivor of military sexual trauma and abuse. They have multiple chronic illnesses, including Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, Dysautonomia, Postural Orthostatic Tachycardia Syndrome, Avoidance Restrictive Food Intake Disorder, Post-Traumatic Stress due to military sexual trauma, and Autism Spectrum Disorder. They served as a broadcast journalist in the United States Army and Wisconsin National Guard. Their life has taken them around the world before they settled in Madison, Wisconsin. They have a bachelor's in sociology from Winona State University and a master's in divinity with a concentration in social justice and ethics from Iliff School of Theology. They have over a decade of experience working in the fields of mental health, post-traumatic stress, invisible disabilities, and queer liberation. Public speaking and sharing their personal story of resilience in the face of adversity are passions of theirs. They have worked with politicians, universities, nonprofits, and congregations throughout North America to help raise awareness about disabilities, mental health, and sexual trauma. And if all that is not enough, they have a memoir coming out soon called My Body's Not Your Dartboard. Pey Carter, thank you so much for being with us today. We're so excited to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome. Hey, it's really hard to know where to start, but I was thinking maybe if you wouldn't mind starting with your process of being an able-bodied person transitioning into someone who's not able-bodied, and I don't even know what the proper terminology is. It disabled? Is it person with disability? How should we talk about this?
So either term is fine to me. I generally say disabled person when referring to myself, because here's the difference. And like I said, however people want to identify, that's their prerogative. When I became physically disabled, so for a long time after the military, I had PTSD, but I was physically able. I could do everything, hike, walk, do laundry, all sorts of things. And then I developed some conditions that affected my body's ability to regulate blood pressure and heart rate when I changed position. I couldn't regulate temperature anymore. So it was a huge adjustment. And in that time where I was so I can get fixed, this isn't forever, this isn't me, I was very person with disabilities, and I would get very offended if anybody said disabled person. Over my journey to embracing my identity, coming to terms with the limitations that my body had, and really listening to what my body was teaching me, I decided to start identifying as a disabled person, because I would find that people would try to invalidate my experiences as a disabled person. And those experiences are vital to who I am and how I experience the world. So I prefer disabled person, but either one is fine.
So, Pey, do you think that your conditions that have developed since your time in the military were caused by your time in the military?
No, so I did not know that I was born with Ehlers-Danlos, which is a tissue connectivity disorder. So it's basically faulty collagen in your body. And the collagen is what holds everything together, right? It's in your skin, it's in your organs, it's everywhere. So I didn't know that I had it. So when I went into the military and all the running on concrete and ruck marches, it really wrecked my lower extremities. So that is something that I had from birth, but I didn't know. And then everything else was developed other than being on the autism spectrum. Everything kind of developed afterwards.
What is kind of the timeline of how you found out or knew about what's going on with you and your body?
So the incident that caused my PTSD happened in 2004. It was just a couple of months after I graduated high school, about 6 months after my 18th birthday. So from, then for many, many years, I primarily had PTSD. And then in 2017, when I was 29, had to do the math for a second.
I would have to too.
I actually got shingles, and the rash wasn't that bad, but it caused permanent damage to my body. And that, is when during the treatment for that, they realized that I had Ehlers-Danlos and just how my body was damaged. And we're connecting these dots. That's why I've had to have my foot permanently fused. That's why, I have lower back and hip pain. And then just along the way, my body has progressed to getting different diagnoses. And that's primarily because Ehlers-Danlos, like I said, because it's all in your tissues, it has a comorbidity with a lot. So pretty much everything but my post-traumatic stress can be a comorbidity with EDS.
Including autism spectrum?
Including autism.
Interesting. Very interesting.
And maybe this is beyond what you'll be able to tell us, but how are those two even connected? I mean, I don't know. I mean, is that something that is always a part of being on the spectrum? Or, I mean, how does that generally come about, do you think?
It's, the brain, right? And if you have faulty collagen, it does affect your brain in different ways. So, even though the shingles caused my POTS and dysautonomia, I was predisposed because of my Ehlers-Danlos. Same with my fibromyalgia, I was predisposed because of my Ehlers-Danlos. It was actually interesting because a few weeks ago, so I identify as agender and queer. I had top surgery in 2021, and I just came across an article that was actual medical research that was released in December of last year that talked about the correlation between Ehlers-Danlos and people with gender dysphoria in that connection. And they did the research on adolescents, and it was, I believe, 60% of the adolescents they studied identified as trans, and then 14% as non-binary, and then it just kind of went on a little bit, but it took me by surprise.
Fascinating, actually. Fascinating. Your autism diagnosis was one of the more recent ones. How has that affected your life?
Well, I found out through a friend who came across the diagnosis and thought, this might be for you, the Avoidance Restrictive Food Intake Disorder, which, so it's kind of, it takes picky eating to a whole other level. It's very sensory compared to other eating disorders where it's, body image and weight. You're just really picky because of how food tastes, smell, things like that. When I got diagnosed with that, I really started paying attention to how my body was as sensory issues, which I already knew, like some of it was because of my PTSD. And I found sensory processing disorder. And I thought, well, there are people that have that and ARFID and don't have autism. So I went to that appointment thinking I just had a sensory processing disorder and not autism. And I came out with a diagnosis of autism. And it explains a lot. It's of course, my ARFID is my 7th diagnosis and autism is my 8th, but I really have been able to see what masking I've been doing and what is part of PTSD and what's not, what's part of the autism.
Is the diagnosis super important to you? Does it help, or is it a hindrance medically, or how does the diagnosis change a person's life? I think that's a really important topic.
It's validating. There's a lot of people, especially in the communities that I belong to, because like Ehlers-Danlos is rare. Not a lot of physicians know about POTS and some of the other things that, a lot of us self-diagnose. But when we are actually able to find a doctor who can put that diagnosis in our chart, it's so relieving. So initially I was like, oh gosh, more diagnoses to add to my list. But then it was like, all right, now I can understand what my body needs, what I need to do to be able to really interact in society. It gave me the resources that I needed to do that.
And so how's it been navigating the medical system with the various diagnoses? I mean, we know, just being a human in America, we know that our medical system is supremely fucked up and not ideal. And I'm sure there's probably a whole other level of not ideal when dealing with the VA. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I would say probably 75% of the advocacy work that I have to do for myself is with the VA. It's very difficult and it's very challenging. I have a 100% rating due to PTSD. So the VA has to provide me with health care regardless of if it's service connected or not. So they have to provide care for all of my conditions. If they are not able to, they have to send me out in the community to go to, other hospitals that aren't VA.
Good.
But it's hard to do that sometimes. Like when I was wanting to get evaluated, say for avoidance restrictive food intake disorder, I had medical journals that connected the dots between EDS and, some other things. And my doctor was like, all right, let's get you evaluated. But I had a blockage at the hospital with mental health because they didn't want to send me into the community until they evaluated me, but they openly said they didn't diagnose and treat ARFID or autism. But, and it's like, well, if you don't treat or even, evaluate it for me, why am I having to go through all these steps? But it's difficult. I had to get my senator involved on more than one occasion.
Oh, wow.
Which, is mind blowing to my friends that are civilians because it's, it's like, what?
Yeah.
And one of the stories with my dysautonomia and my POTS and my body's, inability to regulate things, when I was really sick, and I still do it today, I have a really high salt diet that I have to maintain. 10,000 milligrams is my goal per day, 10 to 12,000, when 1,200 is like the limit from the American Heart Association. So to give you an idea, I have to get almost 10 times the recommended limit. And that's very hard to do. And I was very, very sick and my veins are very hard. With my Ehlers-Danlos, they flex, they're thin, they move around. So it's very hard to get a needle in me. So I would go to get saline infusions because a bag of saline has 9,000 milligrams of salt in it. And it would take 6-8 nurses to get a vein in me. I'd have my veins blown. It was horrible. So I had a nurse case manager that was like, you should get a chest port put in, like for cancer patients. But then I could just do saline at home, or if I needed to come in, boom, they could access it. And my doctor approved it. Got shut down because some veteran at one point got an infection, so they wouldn't do it. Then I finally got, over that, because people were like, she's mentally capable. They're mentally capable of doing this. And then so it goes to pharmacy to see if they can send you the prescriptions for the saline bags, the needles and everything. And the director of pharmacy, who I had never met in my whole entire life, turned it down because they thought that if I had a chest port, that I would start doing drugs.
Oh my God.
Because of, the instant you put something in there, boom, your heart, puts it all over, like for a better high. And I couldn't get them to budge. So I had to get I got Senator Baldwin involved because the VA is a federal agency. It answers to the government. 3 days later, a port was put in.
That's amazing. I had no idea. Do veterans, is that a common occurrence? Do veterans have to reach out to senators to get care?
One of the times, it's with like VA compensation and trying to get healthcare system. The reason why I really push back when I have an issue with the VA, because there's many times where I could just be like, you know what? Okay, I'm not even going to bother, is we have veterans that are dying on waiting lists that don't have access to adequate and consistent healthcare. Excuse me. And there's a reason why, if you pay attention to the news, that veterans are dying by suicide at VA parking
Right.
lots.
Right.
And there's a reason for that, because they're not getting the mental health care that they need. And so every time that I fight and I push back, I do it because there's other veterans out there who don't have a voice, who don't know how to do it, and therefore just giving, up on trying to get access to health care. So it's very difficult to navigate with the VA.
Hey, you're a hero.
Absolutely.
You're a hero. Thank you for doing that. It's not easy to advocate. It's not.
But the patient advocate that I have, because I moved to a different VA system, which has been problematic, but I have a really awesome patient advocate, and we recognize each other when we call. We don't even, have to know who. We just hear the voice, we automatically know. And she has a vision board in her office. And I'm on that vision board, which is really, really cool.
That's awesome.
That's so cool.
And then she's a hero too.
Wow. So, Pey, is it getting any better? I mean, you've been dealing with the VA for so long now, for a number of issues. And yes, I'm sure it's better in some ways for you because you've gotten better at being an advocate for yourself. Has the system gotten any better at working with veterans who are in crisis in whatever form of healthcare?
I think it's hit and miss. It really depends on what VA system you're in. For example, Madison, Milwaukee serves Wisconsin. You have Chicago that serves this area. You have Minneapolis that serves this area. So I think it really matters. It depends on from one VA system to another what people's experiences are like. I remember having to get a taxi, and the person driving was a veteran, and he was talking about how he needs a power wheelchair, and he had one and it broke, and it's like 6 months later, and he's still waiting for the VA, and he thought that was totally normal. Oh, they're going to provide it for free. I'm like, you should not be waiting 6 months for a mobility device. And it depends. When they send me out to the community, which they have to do because of where I'm located, but also because of my conditions that they don't treat, that's usually when it gets better. The struggle that I do have, which I just had recently, was when they send me to a specialist and for a treatment plan. I come back with that treatment plan and they don't want to follow it. That is the most frustrating part for me. So for example, for my Ehlers-Danlos, I see a doctor that's like nationally recognized for Ehlers-Danlos and fibro. I also have fibro. Like, he was on the board, the medical board that determined like the criteria and treatment like for fibromyalgia. And so going to him for a treatment plan and coming back and it just being disregarded, like I've got to have PT on all my lower extremities, being in the military. And, I've had physical therapy before. I don't know if you have. Right. Where you go, maybe 1 to 2 times a week or every other week, you meet for half an hour, 45 minutes. They give you exercises, right? That's normal PT. And the first appointment, they're for an hour. The first appointment, he evaluated my knees and then gave me a TENS unit, no exercises. And the appointment I had last week, again, an hour, where he evaluated in depth my lower back and both hips. Gave me one exercise to do, but that's only if I'm in a lot of pain, and is ordering me a brace. That's not PT.
No, not at all.
Not at all. So it's still a challenge battling with the VA.
So on top of all of the things you have going on with your body and just living your life, trying to navigate all that, you also have to deal with the anguish and the bullshit of people not believing you and not working with you. How do you maintain your sanity and all this? Like, how do you not just lose your shit all day long?
Well, I think the hardest part is because I don't look disabled. I use a wheelchair when either I'm just really dizzy or I'm in a lot of pain, because I am looking at probably double hip replacement by the time I'm in my mid 40s, so late 40s. or have really big, awesome, bulky custom knee braces. But say, for example, if I'm using my walker, I don't use it to walk. I use it so I have a seat if I start to get dizzy. And people are used to, somebody using a walker who struggles to walk. So then it's, you're faking it or you're doing it for attention. I had garbage put into the basket of my walker one time when I was at a rock and gem show with my kids, and I looked at a table and I looked back and there was garbage in the basket of my walker. I get approached parking in a disabled spot because people think like that I've borrowed my grandfather's car to get closer parking. And so it's difficult. It's difficult too when I go and I speak, because people come up and be like, what's your credentials, like, to speak about disabilities? And it's like, here, let me share my list with you.
Yeah.
And it shuts them up. The biggest challenge that I have to deal with when I'm doing advocacy work, which I know how to navigate it now, it took me a while, and I think there's a lot of disabled people that also deal with this, is other people trying to fix them. And there's people that are well-intended, but they get very forceful about their ideas, like diets or books or this treatment and that treatment.
Mhm.
And it's difficult as a disabled person because maybe you're in a space where you're not fully coming to terms with what is going on in your body, to then have other people like reminding you need to be fixed. Or you're in a spot like me where you've come to terms with it, but you just have to deal with people all the time trying to fix you. And that's actually where the title of my memoir, My Body's Not Your Dartboard, came from, because last year I went to go do a talk and I was talking about my difficulty with my disabilities, and I had a plan for my master's, and then that went out of the window because of my medical issues. And I was talking about how people approach me, and
Mhm.
and afterwards I had somebody come up, and you could probably guess what the demographics of this person
Yeah.
was. But they just came up and they were just like, oh, you can take your diploma into any company and they'll want to hire you. And it's like, no, not when, maybe 50 years ago, and not very many people had masters. But when you're in like this specific niche, I can't just go into any. And then it was, well, you could work from home. And, I was trying to like say, no, I can't do that because of this. No, I can't do that because of this. And he just kept going. And I managed to turn to somebody else and talk to them. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw this mom with these two girls coming up, and the girls looked so excited to talk to me. And I like never see straight, like, children I don't know excited to talk to me after I've, spewed information. And as I turned to them, the guy interjects, and he wanted to start off with other ideas for how I can stop people from approaching me, like wearing a really huge medical ID bracelet and wearing my dog tags. And I like, at that point, I was just like, I can't anymore. And I was just like, this is a perfect example of ableism. You're trying to tell me that you know more about my body than I do. Like,
Mhm.
and he was just
Sounds
like,
like
I was just trying to throw.
mansplaining.
Yeah. And, and
Oh,
there was just, he's like, I'm just trying to throw things at you to see if something will stick. And I'm just like, I'm not your dartboard. Like, that's
yeah.
not helpful.
Right.
That's
Yes.
not
Yeah.
helpful. And I was very firm, and I was like, no, you're not going to interrupt me anymore. I am done talking to you.
Good for
And I
you.
turned, and it was this mom and these girls that had Ehlers-Danlos, and they hadn't met anybody else with EDS. And I was like, I hope I just gave you a really good example on how to advocate for yourself.
That is
Yeah.
fantastic.
And I
Fantastic.
told the person running the event, I pulled them aside, and I'm like, you might not get a good review from this person. And this is why.
Oh, well,
They were just
seriously,
shocked.
good for you for, first off, for standing up to that guy and just saying, look, I'm done. I'm not talking to you anymore. And I'm not your dartboard. So, yeah. And then thankfully, those little girls got to see that. And so they know from a young age now that they can stand up for themselves, and they can tell somebody, okay, that's it. I'm done with this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
You're a rock star.
Now the girls, their mom has it as well, or
Yeah,
just
all
the
three of
girls?
them did.
And then you and your daughter both have it. Is it hereditary? Ah,
It's genetic. The type there's 13 subtypes.
uh-huh.
And I believe depending on what subtype you have, it's a different probability. For the type that I have, it's, I believe, 25% that a child could get. So it just depends on what part of the system is more affected. So, and they have different severity and mortality rates. So for example, vascular has a very high mortality rate. It's not as common. The type that we have is hypermobile EDS. So it's one of the more common ones. Generally, everybody with EDS, no matter what subtype, have things like fragile skin, easy bruising, hypermobile joints. For people with HEDS, all of our joints are hypermobile. So yes, my daughter has it, and then my son has a related joint hypermobility syndrome. They kind of have a separate diagnosis for people that have hypermobile joints, but they don't have the other symptoms that you commonly see with EDS. So that could be like GI issues, things like that.
And your daughter and you are working on a project together. Tell us about that.
We are.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not disabling for her at this point. As soon as I got diagnosed, I went to have them evaluated because I didn't know, went into the military, had my first major surgery, in my early 20s, I've had multiple, and I don't want that for them. So I thought it was really important to get them evaluated just so that we can help them live as full of a life as they can while being, protecting their joints. And so she has a lot of accommodations and she doesn't look like she needs them. So it's hard at school for other kids to understand. And with it being a bit more of a complex diagnosis, it's hard for her to answer those questions and explain. So frequently I go to her pretty much every time she changes a grade. I go in and I talk about it, why she uses a special chair. She can't sit in a regular one, why she needs to get up and take walk breaks during the day, why she can use a keyboard or somebody scribes for her if her wrists get too tired, why she sometimes needs alternate P activities, things like that. And so she had just come up to me one day and she was like, I want to write a book that will help explain Ehlers-Danlos to other kids. And she was like, and I want other kids to, like, with Ehlers-Danlos, to know that there's other kids out there with it, which I was like, as an advocate and as a mom, I'm like, this is awesome. Yeah. So we've been working on it. We just started working with an illustrator, which is awesome. And while we're in that process, I was just like, oh, a coloring book would be really awesome because there's a lot of Ehlers-Danlos puns and humor out there, like Flexi and I know it. My joints go out more than I do. Yeah,
it's cute.
It's great. There's just so many. I designed one and I was like, well, I'll put it up on Kickstarter. We'll kind of make it a Kickstarter only project. And I was really surprised that it was fully funded within a few days of launch.
Yeah, congratulations.
Like less than 40% of all Kickstarters are ever successful. And so it was fully funded within a couple of days, where I think got 250% funded, and the local news channels have been picking it up, which is it's just amazing. And it makes our eyes light up to see that like people care. And then there's people with Ehlers-Danlos who are seeing this and feeling supported. So she wanted to do a picture book that was based on her lived experiences, basically. So getting diagnosed, having to go through some of those changes. She had to quit gymnastics, couldn't go on monkey bars anymore. So it was a really hard transition. And then using accommodations and kids asking questions, and then having me go in and talk to the students, and then her friends finding ways to include her in games.
Now, if one of our listeners wanted to get the coloring book, they have very limited time left, right? It's almost, the Kickstarter's almost over. So how could they do that?
So you can just go to Kickstarter and search. It's called Dazzle On. And it's called that because zebras are the mascots for Ehlers-Danlos. Because medical, in real life, it's not like hospital and medical TV shows where it's like every episode there's this like diagnosis after running all these tests. Medical
Yeah.
students are often taught, like, if you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras. Something just typical, normal. It's not something fancy. And so a group of zebras are called a dazzle. So we titled it Dazzle On. So you can just go to Kickstarter, or you can go to like any of my social media, and I have the link right now, but it ends March 10th. So
Yep.
Wow.
And this episode launches March 2nd. So get on it, people.
Get on it,
if you
people.
want to get it.
Yeah, because it
So
will not
cool.
be for sale anywhere afterwards. It's just for this Kickstarter campaign. So if it's over, you're out of luck.
That's fantastic. And what a great opportunity for your daughter to, I mean, she had this great idea, and she's seeing it, come to fruition. And she's also, I mean, she's being her own little advocate, and she's educating other people about her condition. I'm in awe of your daughter too. We need to interview her one day too.
I just, paving the way for the generations after us. I just think it's so important. And I think representation in literature is so important.
Mm-hmm.
Even in a coloring book.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
Mm-hmm.
100%.
Absolutely.
So back to your book, you had put out an email a while back with the first chapter, or part of the first chapter.
Mm-hmm.
You started the book with the being with your mom in the hospital. Why did you start there?
So I wanted to start with how I was raised. Like my only real experience that I remember with somebody with a chronic illness was my mother. And so that is actually one of my earliest memories that I have, was going to visit her in the hospital after surgery. And so I thought it was important to write a chapter. Actually, I spread it into two, about how I was raised, what I experienced with other people, and what I thought, disabilities was, or my lack of education, right? Because we're taught to, as a kid, if we see somebody and we get, mom or dad or the parents, look away, don't ask questions, don't anything.
Don't
and
stare.
That kind of just adds to it as adults, is okay, you don't want to look, or they're, something to stare at, if that makes sense.
Totally makes sense.
Before I became physically disabled, I'll admit, if I saw somebody parking in a disabled spot and they didn't look disabled, there would be a second in my mind where I'd question why they were, parking. And so I thought it was important to, show that I had those same thoughts as other people do.
And when is your book coming out?
So we had a bit of a delay, so it should be at the end of this year. I pushed it back a little bit because of the picture book. I thought that was important to get a little bit of a priority.
That's awesome.
What was the process like for writing the book? I mean, we've had other people on who've written books, and it's such an interesting thing. I mean, everybody sort of approaches it a different way of writing their book. What's the process like for you?
So I approached an indie publisher like 10 years ago about writing a book on military sexual trauma, which I just actually ended up just not being in a good place to do that, because it was difficult getting access to consistent
I see
mental
a
health
theme
care
here
from the VA.
Yeah, I see a
so
theme.
even though I was out there doing a lot of, I've been speaking for 12, 13 years now. It's very different speaking in a place and then being able to leave and not see those people again, than putting words down in a book for everybody to read and have access to forever. And so I finally got into a place. I've been asked over the years, like when I speak, oh, you should put it in a book, you should write. And I finally decided last year to start working on my book. But it's funny because how I imagined the layout to be and how I started writing was very neurodivergent than like how a memoir. I was doing it very like this category, And then I got a book coach to help me do an outline, and I realized, oh, this is how typical brains would best follow this story. So it's definitely been a process. I'm in a good place to do it now than I would have been 10 years ago. But it's very cathartic because as you're writing it, you connect the dots, especially when you have like a diagnosis that's recent in the last 2 years and you're writing about stuff from 2 decades ago. You start connecting those dots, and I think that's really helpful too.
It's really interesting. And because your original topic was the sexual assault in the military, do you think that this is I can guess for myself, probably something that people think is rare, but is actually a bigger topic that affects more people than we even know?
So when I was working with the book coach, in laying things out, we decided you've experienced more than can fit in one book.
I could see that.
So I'm actually going to do a separate book that talks more in depth about what happened in the military, as well as abuse that I experienced later on. So in the book that I'm working on right now, it's more just focused on the disability aspect. So getting PTSD, what it was like trying to navigate healthcare. When it happened to me in the military, there wasn't any sort of sexual assault programs like there are now. So they diagnosed me as being bipolar because only men who went to combat had PTSD. So I was forced on up to 4 medications at a time for most of my time in the military. And then as soon as I got out, a civilian, therapist threw that out and said, you have PTSD. So it's going to be a separate book, but it is very, very common. I didn't know that when I got out. I was very quiet about what happened to me for many years. But then the Lackland Air Base scandal came out, and you had survivors all over the place, speaking to CNN. And that's when it really hit me how big of a problem it is. And right around that time, this documentary came out, which I highly recommend. It's called The Invisible War. And it's a documentary that's done on military sexual trauma using statistics from the Department of Defense and then interviewing people. And it's very eye-opening. It's because you'll hear veterans say like, oh, this is a recent problem. This never happened in my day. Bull.
Yeah, no one was allowed to talk about it is what was happening.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep, it's big. I actually, back in 2012, not too long after I saw that documentary, I won a full scholarship to go to an event in Washington, D.C. with other trauma survivors and go talk to politicians about changing policies around military sexual trauma. And that was my first time seeing other survivors and talking to them and loved ones. And the following year, I decided to start collecting stories and writings, and I put it into a theater project called Speaking Out Why I Stand, which was performed locally, and then it was actually performed out in California as well. But hearing all these stories and reaching out in the MST community, because there's just so many scenarios. It's not just, say example, female soldiers, there's male service members, there's children of military families, there's service members who were assaulted during their time, but say by somebody in the civilian world and not being able to get justice for that. And one story that just really shattered me when I was reaching out is I had this elderly lady who's passed away now, saying like, I'm in my 70s, like I don't think my story is like relevant or matters. And I'm just like, are you kidding? This shows like how. And that was the first time she really talked about it. She was assaulted as a military child, and it just got swept under the rug. The parents just were not going to talk about it. And it's across generations. It's across gender identity and sexualities. There's a lot of, myths about who gets assaulted by who. And it's common. I think it's about 26,000+ troops a year.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And then that doesn't even count people where it happens more than once. So when I was putting up the posters locally for my theater project, I had people say like, oh, I had a sister, I had a friend that this happened to. So it's not as uncommon as people think.
Pey, you're shedding a lot of light on shortcomings, and I'm trying to be kind, but shortcomings where the military is involved. I mean, how's the military as a unit responding to this? And even other service people who maybe haven't had these experiences, how are they reacting to all this? Are you getting a lot of pushback from people? I mean, I hate to say it, but are you safe?
I'll go back. What I found out many, many years later is when I enlisted, which was in 2004, obviously just a few years after September 11th, was that the military was in such dire need of soldiers that they were actually waiving people with criminal history. So like domestic violence.
Oh, I didn't know that.
They were waiving. Normally, if you have a charge like that, you can't get into the military. But during that time, there was such a dire need that people were, getting in that had battery, all sorts of charges. And then here you are giving them a weapon and you're putting them in a system of power.
Right.
Right. The military is just full of power, and things are happening. And that's not to say that it's dying down now, 30 years, no, 20. I can't do math today. Decades later, but I didn't know. If I'd have known, I probably would have joined the military at that point. When I first started speaking out, which was right, kind of in that same time frame as Lachlan, I did actually have a National Guard service member. So they enacted programs for military sexual trauma. And I found that the people that run those programs, people that say it's not an issue, right? It's not an issue in the military. Or you have people service members that will say it is an issue, and this is how I'm trying to combat it by doing training, etc. I had a service member that would follow me around Wisconsin to the different places that I spoke at to try to say that it's not an issue, that I'm one in a million. And so I reported him and never saw him again. But I've never felt unsafe talking as a military sexual trauma survivor. I've been working with a local battalion that kind of has me go to different bases across the country to go talk and help train higher ups about military sexual trauma, which COVID kind of put a wrench in that, unfortunately. But I'm back to doing that this year, which I'm really excited about. And I always had really good responses and good questions, except this one of the last times I did it, there was somebody that just wasn't understanding how it's not appropriate to be making sexual jokes while in uniform, while on duty. He could understand why you can't go to work drunk or on drugs, but the idea that you can't talk about other people's body, he was not getting it. And it didn't matter how anybody, whether the people on the panel or his chain of command was trying to explain it, he just wasn't getting it. And that really shocked me.
I'm glad that you're safe. And
Me too.
I am so appreciative of your bravery, not just having joined the military, but to speak out about what happened to you and what your experience has been and continues to be, honestly, with the military. And my hat is off to you for that, because that can't be easy, and I don't want that to go unacknowledged, that you're doing something that's I'm sure quite difficult to do. So thank you for doing that.
Well, it circles back to people not having a voice or not being able to talk about it. Or there was one story that came out of doing the performance, the theater project that I talked about. There is a man, Gary, who is a veteran, but his daughter served, and he was very proud, encouraging of her serving. And she got discharged, and a few days later, she died by suicide. And it wasn't until he found her journals that he found out that she was assaulted, that she was forced on medication. Then they kicked her out with a dishonorable discharge. And so I have this part in my theater project, him talking about how he's constantly fighting to, get her discharge upgrade so she could be buried, and it's get honors and things like that. And I had written a poem, and I'm not going to be on stage, so somebody else was reading it. We had all these community actors and people who were very interested in being a part of it, reading these stories and letters from survivors. And the person that read my poem connected with this man, and they're married now.
Oh, wow.
That's awesome.
Yep. And so that's just really neat. But there's so many people that we have lost along the way because of military sexual trauma. And I am very privileged. I actually just did a whole thing about privilege a couple of days ago, about how I even have privilege within the communities that I belong to. So for example, I had an honorable discharge. There's a lot of veterans, especially military sexual trauma survivors, that do not have that. I have 100% for PTSD, which a lot of veterans do not get 100%. I had to fight tooth and nail for it, but I have it, which provides me financial security for the rest of my life. It provides crappy, but access to some form of health care. And there's a lot of disabled people in general that don't have that. They're fighting for Social Security, which is a bare minimum amount to barely even survive. I use that privilege. I use that time and that energy that I have to try to raise awareness, not just sharing my stories, but the stories of others. And then also helping people, like, lift them up. I think that's one of the greatest things that I've been able to do. I just had somebody contact me the other day who has a child that has the same conditions and is struggling, and, asking me for advice on how to navigate the health system and how they can help their child. And it's just like, I'm really I'm helping somebody. Or when I graduated with my master's, I needed a lot of accommodations. And of course, I don't look like I need those accommodations. And when there's incoming students that are asking me how to navigate and how to speak up for themselves, it's a privilege. I am privileged to be able to do that.
That's beautiful. Was there anything you wanted to let our audience know that we didn't give you the opportunity to speak about?
Some of the important things that I learned when I became disabled and as a disabled person, which I think also apply to everybody in general. One of the lessons is the importance of self-care and listening to our body. That's very difficult as a disabled person because we're often fighting internal ableism, but it's also difficult for anybody, right? We're in a very capitalistic society where we put our self-care and our health on hold. And it's like, then we get headaches and we get migraines and we get fibro and all sorts because we're pushing ourselves. And I think that there's a lot of just lessons that able-bodied people can learn from disabled people because we experience the world differently. We're very good creative problem solvers. We have a deep sense of empathy. And so inclusion is really important as well. Back to the capitalist, actually, if I could share something real quick. On my TikTok feed, occasionally you'll have people that post, clips from 911 calls or whatever. And it was this call from this man to his mom. He was in the second tower, 9/11, and his, it hadn't been hit yet, but he was leaving this message to say, okay, we're all right. The plane hit the first tower. It was really scary. I saw a man, jump out of a window. We'll just probably be working here till the end of the day. And, give me a call back. That's like literally what it said. And I'm thinking, this is just a perfect example right here of, capitalism, because who would say that? Who would make an employee stay when you're in a tower and there's another plane that's just hit and you have people jumping out? Why would you do that? That should be hey, take the week off. And I think how many lives would have been saved if people are like, okay, like this is huge.
Evacuate.
Evacuate.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think about that, in general too, like how we're just pushing ourselves so much and how we're focusing on productivity equals worth. And so that's a difficult thing to navigate.
It's a huge topic right now, one that I would like to delve into in so many ways. It's a huge topic. How do we overcome it and change it? That's the big question of our time, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it touches on so many different parts of our lives and parts of our society. So there's a lot to tackle there. Well, Pey, thank you so much first of all, for being an advocate and being a voice, being that source for people who can't do it for themselves, and for shedding a light on topics that probably don't get enough attention. Thank you for bringing that to us. Thank you for talking about it so widely and basically using your struggle and what you've learned during that whole process to help other people. I mean, I think about those two little girls with their mom who are so excited to talk to you. I mean, who knows how that's going to ripple out from them? I mean, who knows what they're going to do because of them getting to hear you and getting to meet you and speak with you. Your reach, I don't even think is completely realized yet. Thank you for all of the work that you're doing.
Thank you for having me.
Your work has touched me. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Pey. Let us know when the book comes out too, so we can tell everybody all about it and have you back to talk about the book more once it's out.
Oh, that would be great. Maybe when the picture book's out, my daughter can come on with me.
Yes, that would be amazing. That would be fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pey. What a great topic. I mean, there's so much there. And one thing that kept popping up for me when Pey was talking was when we talked to 10 early on, and she was talking about some of the same issues of invisible disability.
Agreed.
Right? That, people would give her snide looks and make comments and things like that because she doesn't look like she is disabled. Or they would be like, well, why are you parking here? And why are you using a cane? You don't need that cane. We all, at some point, have had that same thought process of
make assumptions.
Yeah, we all make assumptions. And thankfully, people like Pey and Tin and who knows how many other people are talking about this so that hopefully it'll start to sink in for the rest of us that, we don't know what somebody else is going through. We don't know what somebody else's history is. We don't know what somebody else's load to bear is. Everybody's doing the best they can with what they've got.
You put that into beautiful words, Raquel. And the only other thing I have to say about it is we need to do better by our veterans.
Oh my God.
We just need to do better.
Yeah. We have people who not only give their lives, but their bodies, especially in Pey's case, where all of the beating up that their body took through boot camp and being in the service kicked off all these other things that maybe wouldn't have started at that point, maybe wouldn't have started for maybe a few more decades, but now have impacted them as a young person. We as a society, we need to do so much better, and we need to listen to them. They need to feel safe to talk about what's happened and what they've been through.
We need to do better. Bye, Raquel.
Bye, Jennifer.
Thanks, everyone, for listening today. We will be back with more Madness Cafe next week. You can find us on Instagram at Madness Cafe Podcast or email us at madnesscafepodcast@gmail.com. Bye.